Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second and final part of our Heritage webinar series, Revelations, the Legacy of St. George's Church, Penang, and Anglicanism. I think you all had a chance to look through the house rules. I just want to enunciate two particular rules. One is, please turn off your microphones and your video. This session is being live recorded, and also the second part is the most important part. You have a chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or need clarification at any point as we move along, please type the letter Q in your chat box and keep a note, private note, of the question that you intended to ask. So as I see these queues developing, I will then find a time where we could break into an impromptu Q&A session, or we will definitely have one at the end of the session tonight. So again, thank you very much for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second part of our two-part series this month. And so I'm going to take you through a little recap of what we covered in the first part. And I believe Miriam is going to put some slides on that will help us cover the first century of when the church was in existence. As you know, the church is 201 years old this year. So it all began, at least as far as recorded history allows us to keep track, in 1796. And it started with early worship amongst the 17 or 18 English settler families that were in what was known as Prince of Wales Island at the time, and what is today Penang, of course. The services were held actually at the Government House, which is in the site of Convent Light Street in Penang, and the Fort Cornwallis Chapel. So it wasn't until 1816 that the church began being built and was completed in 1818. The first service was the Christmas service in December 1818. The Anglican Church in Asia at that time, in all of Asia, was primarily based out of St. George's Church in Madras, what is today Chennai. But the Bishop Thomas Fanshawe Middleton, who oversaw the spread of Anglicanism outside of England's shores, envisioned a base in Southeast Asia, and particularly the Straits of Malacca, which was just booming with a lot of trade, for a faster and more effective route to sharing the gospel. So Bishop Middleton came to Penang and consecrated the church on May 11th, 1819. The church was built by convict Indian labor, and it was financed from funds from the opium trade, as the British East India Company dictated, following its guiding principles of merchant, military, missionary. Education became a priority under Reverend Hutchings' watch, and he began by establishing the famous Penang Free School, the term free, of course, referring to it being open to all races and creeds, although only for boys, with the express aim of creating, quote, intelligent and honest servants of the government, end quote. A Tamil class was opened within the initial Penang Free School, and Penang Free School did not cease operations, not even for a day, since it was established in 1816 to the present day, despite moving multiple locations within Penang. Girls' education became a priority for the Anglican Church in Penang in the 1880s. And it actually began in the veranda of a Reverend Biggs' home in 1884. He was the vicar of St. George's Church at the time, and his wife gave lessons to local girls. St. George's Girls' School was then established in 1885. Local and Asian figures of note at that time include Reverend Royapen Balavendram and Tan Lu Gi, also known as Mrs. Lim Kim Swa. Reverend Balavendran came to Penang from India to take care of the spiritual needs of the Indian community, many of whom were descendants of the Indian laborers, the Indian convict laborers that I referred to earlier, who were responsible for building the church. Mrs. Lim Kim Swa, or Tan Lu Gi, as her maiden name was, arrived in Penang from China via Thailand. And she was a businesswoman, and she is credited with expanding Anglicanism into the Chinese merchant community in Penang. A notable achievement of hers was she translated the Book of Common Prayer into Hokkien, which was widely spoken in Penang at the time. In World War I, the British abandoned the church, and it remained closed to the world, and the world was ravaged by a pandemic and war. Nevertheless, local Anglicans, it's important to note, continued to hold on to the faith, and they were very active in worship in their own communities, led by local clergy people, local lay people. After World War I, the British returned along with the missionaries, and it was business as usual, with a continued, although weakened, focus on educational institutions. Penang Free School had become very overcrowded and moved to a new location, in its present location, in Green Lane, Penang, of 30 acres of land. Its primary school at the time remained adjacent to the church and was renamed Hutchings School in honor of Reverend Hutchings. And today, Hutchings School is a thriving primary and secondary school, and Penang Free School, it goes without saying, has graduated many of Malaysia's most notable and high-achieving individuals. In 1926, another milestone year, the St. Nicholas Home for the Blind and Crippled, as it was known then, was established in Malacca to address the social issue of physically challenged babies who were being abandoned at missionary hospitals and churches. St. Nicholas Home moved to Penang after a generous gift of 6 acres of land was granted by Lord Nuffield in 1938, and thus began the close association of the St. Nicholas Home for the Blind with St. George's Church. And that's where we left off in webinar 1. And so, continuing into webinar 2, the bombs began dropping on Penang on December 18, 1941. The British Straits Governor, Stanton Thomas, ordered the immediate evacuation of all British persons to Singapore, leaving only 5 British individuals in Penang, including the Vicar of Province Wellesley, what is today Seberang Perai, a man named Eric Scott, whom we will talk about more later. The Imperial Japanese Army began advancing into parts of Southeast Asia and Penang in particular, parts of Southeast Asia, and Penang in particular was impacted by aerial bombing. However, many of our viewers may not be aware that the Japanese army did not in fact march onto Penang Island as it did through other parts of Malaya. And this is directly because of the patriotic forethought and actions of 2 Anglican residents of Penang, 2 worshippers of St. George's Church, at St. George's Church. So here with me again is the Vicar and Bishop of St. George's Church, the Right Reverend Charles Samuel. Bishop Charles, can you share the fascinating story of Manika Sodhi Saravanamuttu and Harold Spelderwind with us this evening?
Hi. It's interesting to note how the Anglican Church members at that time played a very significant role in the development of the church as well as the community. During that time, there was one very well-known journalist by the name of Manika Sodhi
Saravanamuttu.
Saravanamuttu. Now, he was the editor of the Echo newspaper at that time. And he was a very learned man. He studied in Oxford, came from Sri Lanka to Malaya, and took over and assisted in the press. He actually helped one of another church member who owned the printing press. His name is Gumit. All right. And now it's in our church, we still have the Gumit Fund established and it's still going on. Now, in the case of Manika Sodhi, he was the president of the Ceylonese Association at that time. And when Japanese came in, it was the Ceylonese community that implored Manika Sodhi to go and bring down the Union Jack flag at the Cornwallis fort. It is because at that time it was known that the Japanese was coming, and if the Union Jack was flying high, they would actually invade and destroy Penang. So Saravanan, along with Harold Spildevin, now he was Manika Sodhi's bodyguard. Now, Harold was also a church member. Together with one young man called Gopal, they went to Fort Cornwallis, and there they tried to lower the Union Jack, and it was all tattered at that time. And eventually, Gopal was the one who climbed up and brought down the Union Jack flag. And at that time, it was then known as an island that did not have any uh, 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 ownership to the British forces at that time. And so we find that Manika Sodhi played a very important role by stabilizing the island of Penang. In a sense, somebody said that he raised a white flag up the pole. And when the Japanese came, it was a free Penang. Although Manika and Harold were all British citizens at that time, yet they brought down the flag and made it possible for the people of the island to live in a very comfortable way. Now, Manika Sodhi played a very important role. Among the tasks that he performed was he assisted in the fundraising to build St. Nicholas Home. And he was one of the prime movers at that time. He was very, and you see that Bill Breuer at the back there, Manika Sodhi, and the left, and there you have the one who actually donated the money. The one in the middle there is a lady called Mary Poole, which I had the opportunity of meeting and extending my pastoral care to her when I was in Kuala Lumpur. She has since passed away. Now, Manika Sodhi had played a very important role in that area. He was also involved in politics, and during that time, he would write a lot of articles in a newspaper. A very good friend of Tunku Abdul Rahman, very close association. And at the same time, Bishop Roland Coe was also very involved in politics at that time too. So when Manika Sodhi passed away, it is interesting that in 1970, Bishop Roland Coe, who was then the first Bishop of West Malaysia, came up to Penang and conducted the funeral of Manika at St. George's. And likewise with Harold Spildevin, he too was alive until recently when I had the opportunity of extending pastoral care to him in his house. And eventually he passed away, and the service was held at St. George's Church.
What great men. And I think it's fairly recent that Eureka Books in Penang has taken on actually researching the life of Sarah, Manika Sodhi Saravanamuttu, and the book, The Sarah Saga, is available in independent bookstores in Penang, including Gerak Budaya and Eureka Books. So moving on from that, that being said, the church building itself was not spared by the aerial bombing at that time. although Penang had become sort of what was known as an open society, as Bishop had said, a freer place to be. So here with us this evening again is Roy Chai, the Heritage Officer at St. George's Church, and we've also pulled in Miriam Samuel, a staff member and researcher at the church. Roy, I'd like to start with you. Why was the church targeted in the aerial bombing?
Hi, my name is Roy here. Okay, it's basically because of the unused bullock carts that were parked along Pitt Street that resemble cannons from the air. That was the cause of why the planes, when they were passing the church area, then the bombs were being dropped. Now, there were 6 bombs were actually dropped onto the compound, and only one causing considerable damage to the roof, the spire, and the internal fittings. The bomb entered through the roof over the gallery at the west end near the main porch, bringing down the part of the gallery and leaving a pile of debris on the floor. Now, the good thing is that the massive structure actually withstood the pounding, but along the years, the east side of the wall was being pulled down by Japanese as a material to build an air raid shelter. So
sorry, Roy, just to clarify a couple of things. So the looting was not just done by locals, it was also done by Japanese themselves?
No. The looting was actually done by the locals itself. Now, during the chaos and evacuation, looters took advantage of what remained of the church interiors. Records were actually moved to parsonage. All the processional cross, the altar cross, the candlesticks, some frontals, and the complete set of vestments with 1 or 2 smaller items were actually removed from the church for safekeeping. But unfortunately, those were also looted off at a later stage. Now, this was actually accounted by Reverend Eric Scott. In the accounts of Eric Scott, he mentioned several things, whereby it did say that, the church was actually in a good position, whereby the damage was just only minor, but along the ways, it was actually being looted. That was the one that caused the whole of the entire church being left as what it was direct state at that time. Now, I'm going into the accounts of Reverend Eric Scott right now. From here, you'll be able to hear the story, what he has actually written. This part is a little bit interesting on the part because, there was also an account whereby we were also reading on a part of the history where, we mentioned that Eric Scott was able to perform services during Japanese occupation. Now, this is what he wrote. The next day, Friday, on the 19th December, first Japanese soldiers were seen slouching about the streets of Penang. The evening of the next day, an order was actually sent around that any Europeans found in the streets of Penang would be shot at sight. I have, however, arranged to get a bag of rice from the dispersal camp on that day for bombing families who were actually sheltering in St. George's Parsonage. I chose what I thought was quiet route, but only got to the corner of Gottlieb Road when I ran into a Japanese post. A soldier pointed his rifle and shouted at me. I stopped my car and got out. Directly, he saw the crucifix on the girdle of my cassock. He tapped it and queried, "Christ?" I said yes, and he took me into his office. So he was actually cross-examination for about half an hour, and at the end, the officer said, "You may go," and I shall never forget. Now, on Monday, he called on the acting Japanese governor of Penang, Mr. Inagi, and were treated by him with extreme courtesy. He was given passes and permission to visit Butterworth, but unfortunately, the Japanese in Butterworth proved to be no courteous, and those 3 days between 23rd until 25th of December, he was actually arrested more than 10 times. He had the chance to visit Bukit Tengah, celebrate Christmas service at St. Mark's, and later one of the parishioners of St. Mark smuggled him back to island in a tongkang. Now, when Inagi was in power, I was free in Penang and had a chance to visit St. George's Church. The damage done to the church was slight. Even the organ was still playable, and we arranged all the pews against the windows by way of barricade and removed everything that was portable to Seneng or parsonage. Governor Inagi's stay in Penang was a very short one. He was replaced within 2 weeks by Hiroyasu, who proved as not pleasant as Inagi. All the remaining British at that time were caught and sent to prison. Reverend Scott himself took residence at St. Nicholas, but during this duration, all the things in St. George's was actually looted and vandalized. That was a time whereby, everything was actually being stripped apart. He encountered that the organ woods were chopped up as firewood, and on the day he managed to visit St. George's again, he saw the bell was actually being offered for sale by the public auction. Now, what was actually looted? He wrote, the relic state of the church is mainly due to looters who were soon got to work, stripping everything in the church and leave nothing behind that cannot be removed. The furnishings that disappeared was a lovely brass lectern, eagle pulpit, communion rails, pews, and kneelers. Memorials were torn off the walls. These include ornamental paving stones from the church, from the floor, which were torn up and stolen. 24 commemorative plaques and statues extolling the glories and the virtues of the company and colonial grandee, and they were reduced to 5 units as of present. Now, the greatest loss was actually the organ itself. It was hacked into pieces, carried away in piecemeal. For days, streets around the church were strewn with remains of the pipe organs and some other instruments. Woods were chopped up for firewood. Now, during this time, the 7 years, the church was also a place for families to seek shelter during Japanese occupation.
Oh, well, what parts of the church did people seek shelter in?
Well, normally it would be the parsonage and the parsonage and the Tamil parsonage and that behind.
I understand later in the war, towards the end of the war, when there was actually some level of American bombing in Penang, there were some prominent figures that actually took refuge in the Francis Light Memorial at the front of the church. Can you share that story with us, Roy?
I think that one Miriam will have more answers, right?
Yeah, Miriam.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I find this story incredibly fascinating, and it revolves around the very prominent lawyer, also known as the Tiger of Geludong, or Kapal Singh. So this goes a little bit forward in time. So we're looking in January of 1945, where there's the presence of American super fortresses that are flying in between Penang Island and Butterworth, so the mainland. And it's interesting because in this biography of Kapal Singh, it writes that for the local community, it either meant 2 things. The first being that the Japanese occupation was coming to an end, so hooray, or the presence of another enemy. And Kapal Singh's father, whose name is Ram Singh Deo, he looked up and he saw the bombers approaching and then ran towards this 3-story house on Green Hall, where they rented 2 small ground floor rooms. And he grabbed his wife and his children, and Kapal Singh was 4 years old at this time, and he's seeing bombs that are dropping on St. Xavier's Institution, where his parents actually intended him to go to school. And there are bombs dropping over there. And in this drainage system that's right outside the house, that's rat infested, he sees his Sikh community, his friends and his neighbors, which have all sought shelter in the drainage in front of their space. So him and his family basically run across the street. If you're familiar with the streets of Penang, you'll know that across the street from Green Hall is the Supreme Court. So they run through the columns of the Supreme Court, and then they cross the street over to Fakwa Street and into this churchyard with this ruined and roofless church building. And Kapal remembers his father sort of asking him, ushering him to hide amongst rubble, somewhere very close to the Francis Light Memorial. And in fact, it wasn't just him. Kapal remembers other families as well who sort of found shelter in the church and around in the surrounding area, so much so that they were sort of kept safe when a misdirected bomb from the American super fortresses exploded right in front of Kapal's childhood home. So I find this incredibly symbolic because a lot of Christians refer to a church or a place of worship as a sanctuary. But during this time, if the Christians or the Anglican community didn't use St. George's Church as their sanctuary, it became instead a shelter and a refuge for many other people, the local community of Penang, whether or not they knew God. So I find that incredibly symbolic during this period.
Yes, I agree with you, Miriam. That's very uplifting to know, especially after hearing about the devastating looting and also the destruction that was done during the war years to the physical building, that it still served such an important role in protecting human life. I'm going to stay with you, with Miriam, for a little bit, because with all this physical and tangible destruction that Roy was describing, tell me about the spirit of the church. I know you've done some research in this area. I'm just imagining with the British colonialists in hiding and the church partially ruined. You know, what were the local Anglicans doing at this time?
Thanks, Mila. The first thing I want to do is paint the chaos of the social and political environment during this time. So on the one hand, we have the Japanese who have landed in Kelantan, in Kota Baru, and they're sort of moving towards Malaya. By mid-December, Penang is bombed. So there is physical destruction. There is the breakdown in law. Who is the authority? Who is the enemy? And morale generally is low. And then on the other hand, the British are withdrawing. So you've got the women and the children who are being evacuated first, and I believe they went to Singapore. And then this was followed by the European men. And lastly, the remaining military personnel. Now, this is important because there is a clear ethnic divide in which the British chose to save their own, and in turn left the locals and the immigrants, who most of them came through the British endeavors, at the mercy of the enemy. One might even say that perhaps sentiments of loyalty lessened and distrust increased, because it was under the promise of protection that the British was able to settle in Penang in the first place. So, of course, when the British withdrew, so did the English-speaking community, which made up the majority of those who attended St. George's Church. Mm-hmm. But I want to point out that this did not affect the growth of the local and indigenized church during this period. There were, however, and I believe these people will be looked into later on, 3 to 5 British men who stayed their ground despite being ordered to go back. One of whom is Reverend Eric Scott, who Mr. Roy has talked a little bit about, and I believe Bishop Charles will also talk about him. And his story is very significant as we see the church move from St. George's to St. Nicholas later on. Now, I also want to bring in a quote, and I have this on the slides. Just let me pull this up for you. And this was written in the Straits Times in 1956. It says, "But stones and buildings do not make a church. The spirit of the Church of St. George the Martyr, St. George's Church, lived on, moving the site of its worship from place to place as necessity commanded." Now, if I wanted to break down that sentence, what I will say is that the church is first and foremost the people, and it is not at all limited by a physical building. And as we established in part 1 of the webinar, the Anglican Church was not limited to those who attended St. George's Church, because we already saw the growth and the expansion of the Chinese and Tamil mission groups. But what I will say is that whilst the English-speaking community worshipped in St. George's Church, those who communicated in vernacular languages, as I said, had already been able to expand their groups and their ministry. Therefore, the bombing and the ruin of the church did not affect their ministry. Now, in a post-war report, it does highlight that Asian clergy seemed to show more of a devoted service, and the life of the Anglican Church actually reached high levels, despite what was going on around them. And for the first time, a real sense of fellowship and community in the interest of the church membership. And I think this is especially important because before the war, during the British administration, very clearly in the nation, we see something called racial polarization for economic advancement. And unfortunately, these sentiments creeped into the church. And what happened is that the Europeans, the Indians, and the Chinese were all in their individual sections, using the difference of language as an excuse, I would say. But this war, what this war did was actually brought a unity among the congregation. So we see that all three congregations, the English, the Tamil, the Chinese people, at this point, the Chinese were conducting services in 7 different languages, Chinese languages. And you know, the Indians had 3 different languages. That's amazing. That shows so much of growth among these 2 ministries. And they were all brought together. They read Bible readings in all 3 different languages. They sang hymns in all 3 different languages to the same tune. In fact, there's at one point on Easter Day in 1944, there were 700 people of all denominations who gathered together inside and around the Chinese mission house to celebrate Easter Day in the middle of a war. How amazing is that? Yes. So, you know, I will move on and I will pass the baton, but there are 2 figures that I just want to bring out, and I believe they will be covered. And they are Reverend Huang Tung-Si and S. Charles, who stood at the forefront of bringing together the unity and reconciliation. And their stories are definitely very significant during this period.
Okay, thank you, Miriam, for that. The endurance of the human spirit is amazing. Bishop Charles, if I can move to you, could you explain what happened in terms of clergy and lay leadership of the local communities in those years at St. Nicholas? You'll need to unmute your microphone, Bishop.
The World War II is sometimes considered as a bleak moment in the life of the country. But on the contrary, if you look at the life of the church, this is the second time that St. George's Church was empty. In other words, after the bombing, the church was empty. But although the church was empty, the missionary work of the church was very much alive and thriving. Now, we know in the Chinese, St. George's Chinese congregation at McAllister Road was growing under Reverend Huang Tung-Si. And even though they did not have enough money during that time, they were in debt, yet during those times, they were able to build a new church called St. Paul's Church. At the same time, during that time, you find that the Chinese were conducting services, the Tamils were conducting services, one by S. Charles. is known as Sigamani Charles. Nothing to do with me, but apparently there are so many Charleses in St. George's Church, so you need to be careful about which Charles you're talking about. But here you have this guy, Sigamani Charles, Huang, who are all locals who then came together, conducted services in different languages, and got the people together right at that very point, planting the seed of unity, planting the seed of being one in the body of Christ. And they were able to worship. They were able to worship at St. Nicholas' home, at St. Paul's Church, McAllister Road. And together during this time, these people worked very hard. And as Miriam has mentioned about the different services, the church was actually growing. The different linguistic groups were thriving. There was a huge congregation, although the English-speaking congregation was limited to only the British and to a few.
The local clergy appeared to have assumed leadership roles in this vacuum left by the British. Although, as I understand, Bishop, that they were permitted to only be called acting vicars, yes, albeit to absent vicars. Roy, can I go on to you, and if you can share more about this sort of legendary Reverend Huang Tong-si and Reverend S. Charles and any other notable leaders at the time?
Yeah, as what Bishop Charles and Miriam has mentioned, the indigenous priests were actually upholding the services during Japanese occupation. Now, as soon as after the church was bombed, they have to hold their services in those days in the following places. The Tamil congregation was actually having at one of the parishioners' house, Dr. Muthu's residence. English speaking was actually at St. Nicholas' home. The Chinese congregation held it at the mission house at 56 McAllister Road, which actually finally became the chapel for the three congregations along the years. Now, Reverend Huang did accounted that during those Japanese occupation, the difficulties of organizing services was actually what he deemed as politically hell. This is what he wrote. Chinese congregation for 3 years and 8 months were politically hell, yet to the grace of God, the work among them went steadfastly, though they were slow. Average 50 communicants at Eucharist and 150 more attended each of the 2 services. 7 families were actually forced to go to province Wellesley as part of a Grow More food campaign. I paid 5 pastoral visits to them. I'll share what the rules imposed by the Japanese government shortly on that. Now, Reverend Charles also has to take over English-speaking congregation after the departure of Reverend Scott to the internment camp but he was also assisted by the lay reader called Mr. Victor Landberg. He managed to hold regular services in English in Mission House. Now, Holy Communion was celebrated every Sunday for the first few months, but later, owing to the ill health of priests in charge of Tamil, Reverend Sagamani Charles, Bishop is not you, definitely, I had to go to Butterworth on 1st, 3rd, and 5th Sunday. Now, the Tamil congregation held services by Reverend Sagamani Charles at Dr. Muthu's residence, and later in 1942 and 43 in the mission house at McAllister Road. In 1944, Reverend Sagamani Charles' health gave way and was advised to have a very long rest. Since then, the Tamil services had to join English-speaking services. Reverend Sagamani Charles actually died on the 24th August 1945. After his death, Reverend Huang Tong-si wrote that he was the only Anglican priest in North Malaya and had to take over Tamil work for Penang and Province Wellesley, and as well as the English service. Now, going back to the part of whereby he mentioned, the Chinese congregation and the Anglicans services were actually given, I mean, were politically held because of Japanese occupation. He wrote that, you know, they were actually Japanese policy towards religion that was actually hindering them. He wrote it in a way that, you know, he mentioned all priests from Roman Catholic and Protestants were called to attend 4 meetings by Director of Education and Religion Department, emphasizing at each of these meetings that preachers must draw much attention to train their church parishioners to be loyal and cooperative to the Japanese government, able to report to military police of any communist or anti-Japanese found among Christians. They have also got to receive instructions from propaganda department as well, and also governor of Penang, the Japanese governor. All preachers are to submit to chief propaganda department stating the sermon subject 2 days beforehand. Marriages must be reported to the propaganda department with names of the family 2 days beforehand. Nippon flags to be hoisted on all Japanese activities. They have to furnish the list of congregations and all detailed means of communication to each of their denomination churches. All kind of a communication, you have to have a copy to send it to them. They also have to submit history of church, even though on that part, he mentioned that the Anglican church's history were all gone, so he could not do anything. Japanese officers may also pay visit to the church during ceremony, and all must receive them with utmost honor. For the instructions from the governor of Penang, all churches, mission houses, chapels must be registered. All copies of correspondence, regulations of governing and officials are to be attached as well. Now, having said that, as what Miriam has actually mentioned just now, the desire for God was very uplifting. The spirit was actually high during that time. And because of this, they managed to hold 2 significant services during Japanese occupancy, and both also on Easter Day. The first one was actually a service at Mission House on 25th of April 1943, the first Easter, whereby he conducted Holy Communion together with Reverend Sagamani Charles in a combined service. Readings were actually made in English by Mr. V. Lambert, Tamil by Dr. Mutu, Chinese by Mr. Oi Kim Pong. There were 288 communicants attended. Now, the second service actually brought a greater desire, okay, whereby they managed to combine the Anglicans and the Methodist denominations together. The rites of both denominations were actually adopted during that service, where the Methodist Church Reverend Timothy Huang conducted the Holy Communion, and Reverend Huang Tungsi, he himself preached the sermon, and 700 people attended the service during Japanese occupation. Imagine the desire, imagine, you know, going against, or not going against, but you know, the part of the Japanese rules and regulations under a very strict law, yet they managed to come together for the glory of God.
Yes. Yes, I do agree with you on that, Roy. To see that unity was amazing, but also just wanted to underline that it was a very dangerous time. And it was a very dangerous time, particularly for a Chinese reverend to be working with all the local populations and spreading the gospel and being there for people spiritually. He was indeed very courageous, Reverend Huang Tungsi. And I did also, was another point that really interested me in what we're discussing is how the British had the stated objective of making, you know, sort of the young people or the children of Penang into intelligent and honest servants of the government. And then you have the Japanese who are interested in making people loyal and obedient to sort of the Nippon flag and the state. So that brings me into the next era, which is in 1948, India achieved independence, and thus began the unraveling of British colonialism and the erosion of the East India Company's wealth and power. Grassroots movements all over the colonies were calling for independence, and Malaya and Singapore were no exception to that. Movements sprouted and flourished. We had the communist insurgency in the emergency years, what is known as Darurat, from 1948 to 1960, and the simultaneous rise of the Malay rights movement. In 1957, of course, Malaya and Singapore were granted independence, which was negotiated by a multiracial coalition, spearheaded by, of course, the father of our nation, Tunku Abdul Rahman, a lifelong resident of Penang and a notable product of Penang Free School, one of the most important institutions to be born of St. George's Church. So while the country as a whole was going through all the social and political upheaval in that period, what was happening to the church and to Anglicanism here in Penang? So we know that when the British returned after World War II, it was not business as usual, as what was the case when they returned after World War I. In fact, Anglicanism was no longer a priority for them because they were in self-preservation mode. So I'm going to bring Miriam in again to talk about some of the key points and key factors. There's little known to many audiences that was going on at that time.
Thank you. So I want to go back to 1874, where the Pangkor Treaty took place, where we see that British residents were appointed to provide advice and guidance upon all matters regarding administration of state and etc., apart from those that touch on the religion and the customs of the Malays. So this non-interference policy basically may sound quite honorable when it comes to interfaith relations, but we must point out that it was most definitely economically motivated. And any incident, particularly that which had to do with religion, and if it was at a place where it would jeopardize the position and the rule of the British in Malaya, anything to do with that was completely avoided. So I got this quote from, let me just pull this up, from this book called Anglicanism, the Global Communion. Let me just pull this up here. Yeah. And it says, when one J.P. Moore adopted Malay dress, he was ordered to return to European dress and cease mission work amongst the Malays. Selling of scriptures were prohibited, and clergy were appointed as chaplains, not missionaries. The clergy that was appointed by the East India Company or the government at this point. Their exclusive task was to minister to the spiritual needs of the English communities. So you have this as a result of the 1874 Pangkor Treaty. And we go back slightly further to 1916. And this year is incredibly important because this is 100 years after the church is sort of built in 1816 and 1818. But in 1916, the church was officially disestablished and the chaplains were no longer appointed or paid for by the government. So in the beginning, the church was built by the EIC and maintained by it. 100 years later, the ownership of the church was left to its people. And, you know, everything was sort of adversely impacted, including their relationship with their schools. So we know Penang Free School was founded by Reverend Hutchings from St. George's, as well as St. George's Girls' School in 1885 by Reverend Biggs, his wife, and received this partnership with Mrs. Lim Kim Swa. But then, when the money just comes off, the church is unable to continue its relationship with the schools. In fact, in 1921, out of the 70,000 Malayan students at that point, only 1%, so 700, attended Anglican schools as opposed to Methodist and Roman Catholic schools. So even the Japanese occupation, when education came into a standstill and eventually the schools reopened, the Anglican Church, because of its lack in funding, was just not able to sustain its involvement, its contributions, and its general governance of the schools that they had. So the only logical thing was to hand it over to the government. And we see after Merdeka, as education reforms happened, as languages became questioned, which language should come first, the Anglican Church was sort of forced into a space where they just could not have even a little bit of involvement in the schools that they had. The only, in terms of St. Nicholas Home, even though it was not founded by us, the pioneers who brought St. Nicholas from Malacca to Penang and advocated for its expansion and its services and its inclusivity to everyone else, that close relationship is still being maintained with St. George's. But in terms of Penang Free School, in terms of St. George's Girls' School, unfortunately, that came to an end, in fact, in the early 1900s.
Thank you, Miriam, for that. The whole concept of religion and state, whether it's one and the same or separate, is always a contentious one. And as you've just expounded, here in Malaysia, there must have been a big impact on St. George's Church because it stood firm on ground that went from belonging to the head of the Church of England and defender of Anglicanism to a Muslim majority free nation. So that has to have had multiple layered effects. And then, of course, we have to remember that this tension between the church and the state was also playing out in the UK. And so the whole concept of British clergy serving abroad began being phased out. And as you mentioned, that, started to materialize into a loss of institutional funding from the UK, which is a very significant fact. I'd like to share, sorry, Miriam?
Sorry, if I may. There's just one little thing that I found out today. I'm going to share this on the screen. And it's quite an interesting quote that shows the people thought that the Anglican Church was this rich institution. So this was in 1955. But in actual fact, they had to essentially beg for every dollar. And this goes back to this this lack of ownership, that the people just didn't take it upon themselves to grow and make sure that the church was able to be self-sufficient without funding from the state. So the public thought that the church was rich, but actually it wasn't. And therefore it just had, it declined in people, it declined in funding, it declined in community engagements, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Miriam. That is a perfect segue for the quote that I'd like to read next, which was from Reverend Batu Malay. And he wrote in his book, which captured the period of 1805 to 2005, he did a significant amount of research. And I'd like to read this quote actually out loud. If you could call it up, please.
Yeah, there it is.
Oh,
sorry. Is it there?
I don't know if you're sharing your screen. I can't see it.
There we go. Yeah.
Right. So in this quote says, due to a lack of adequate staff, funds, certain restrictions, a limited freedom, and a lack of lay missionary leadership, and for other reasons, we were not able to bring more people to Christ. Bishop Charles, on the heels of this very somber quote from Reverend Batu Malay, can you share some context of what appears to be a very low period in the history of the church?
Because from 1955, which Miriam quoted, and right up to 1970, we were struggling. the church was struggling to maintain the building. St. George's was without money. We were waiting for the British to give us some money. And so we find that Bishop Batumale making this quote, not only on St. George's, but on the whole. Now let me examine that point. His statement is a rather sad statement, but it's a very true statement. You will notice that in the year 1969, May 13, 1969, was this racial tension in our country. And of course, we were then the Diocese of Singapore and Malaya. The Singapore and Malaya Diocese then decided that it would be too dangerous if Singapore will hold on to Malaya, and therefore decided in 1970 to form a new diocese of the Diocese of West Malaysia and separate themselves from Singapore. Now, when the separation took place, in fact, we did not have much money. It was all of a sudden the new diocese was formed. The bishop did not have sufficient money, although we had a lot of land in this diocese, but we did not have manpower, did not have enough priests, no local priests were around, we did not have money, we did not have a theological college, and we suffered. We suffered a lot in forming the new diocese. And therefore, when the new bishop, the first bishop, Bishop Roland Koh, came into being, he suffered a lot. He suffered so much that the only way he would think of building the congregation or the diocese was, one, he felt that he needed to establish the theological studies and to encourage as many locals to become priests. Secondly, he felt that the only way that he can build the church was to have a partnership with one of an overseas diocese. Now, he was a very talented man. He was a lawyer by profession and then by education. And then he came in and he was very prominent person in the whole of Malaya at that time. But given that instance, he still struggled to establish the new diocese. And so what Bishop Batumale wrote was indeed true. We had no money even to pay for clergy. And at that time, we had to look to missionary organizations like USPG, CMS, OMF to send clergy down to Malaya to look after the churches and be paid by them. So when those clergy came, their salary was different from the local clergy who were paid, pittance at that time. So there was a lot of imbalance in that training. So Bishop Roland Koh then decided, how can I help this diocese when we did not have anything at hand? So he decided to go to America. He traveled to America, went to Pennsylvania, and in a church called St. Mary's in Pennsylvania, he preached about a partnership program. He wanted to adopt one of the American churches so that the American church could help build our diocese. And while he was preaching, according to Bishop Batumale's records, I want to, because there are many interpretations about what happened to Bishop Roland Koh at that time. But Bishop Batumale said that while he was preaching, he had a stroke at the pulpit and he fell. Okay, and his sermon was actually a begging bowl for the Americans, please help our diocese. And he had a stroke. And a few days later, he passed away. So, the early days were very difficult. Roland Koh wanted to have a theological college. If you see the emblem there, if you go back, if you don't mind, you see the emblem. He was the one who created this crest for the diocese, which we are still using today. He was the one who did that. He was the one who motivated young clergy to come forward. People like Bishop Ponaya Moses, Bishop Batumale. He was the one who gave the impetus for them, supported them, visited them, and to allow for more local clergymen to come forward. So what Bishop Batumale said at that time is indeed true. We had a very difficult beginning and we suffered a lot.
Thank you, Bishop, for sharing that with us. The church celebrated its bicentenary this past year. It was a special time. Can you share with us where the church is today as it enters its 3rd century?
Contrary to what I have said earlier, you find that things are different now. We find that St. George's Church has now taken ownership of the missionary work. As in the early days, when St. George's did not have money even to run the schools, today God has blessed us with land and with the many facilities. God has even blessed us with manpower, people. Our church members have woken up to the challenge and have taken up the ownership. We have celebrated 200 years and we find that our work is growing. One, we see the celebration of 200 years is one to thank God for his bountiful goodness. St. George's is poised for more growth. If you were to look back earlier, at every interval of the life of the church, say the First World War, the Second World War, and even now, let me just take you through this period. The First World War, the church was closed because there was a flu pandemic at the time. And First World War, the British left. The church was empty. When the church was empty, although the church was empty, the Indians and the Chinese missionary work grew a lot. It laid the foundation stone. Second World War, again the second time, the church was empty. And we find that new churches were planted. St. Paul's Church thrived. Tamil missionary work, St. Mark's Batuat was growing. And more local people took up ownership. Now we are at the 3rd point. COVID-19, the church was closed again. Now, if I were to trace that history, I think at every point of closure of the church, God is doing something. God is preparing his people, her people, for something to come. What is it is something that I have to pray. We all have to pray and wait for the moment. Now is the opportune time for the church to wake up, take ownership, and get out and do the missionary work, because God is going to open the doors for something new to take place. In the same way, we find that our relationship with St. Nicholas Home is still there. I'm glad that now that St. George's is still very much part of St. Nicholas Home. St. Nicholas Home is going to celebrate 95 years next year. And it's something that we must rejoice, because St. Nicholas Home is the first blind school in Malaysia, the first blind home in Malaya at that time. It was also the first place where they had a Boy Scout and a Girl Guide for the blind in St. Nicholas. So St. Nicholas Home today is well established and the community at large knows about it. But it's time to take St. Nicholas Home to the next level. We are looking at building a home for the elderly who can live with dignity and honor. We want a home for the elderly blind, and we want to target that in the coming days. So that's St. Nicholas as part of St. George's. In St. George's Church, I want to thank God for clergy, like, we have Reverend Luke Wee, who came out of this church. We want to thank for Joseph Louis, who came out. We want to Chubanit, came out from St. George's Church. We want to thank God for Judith, who was a parish assistant and deaconess. Then we want to thank God for Richard Lowe, who is now our clergy in St. George's. And I hope many more will come. So now is the time. One, when we take ownership, it means that we must involve ourselves in the missionary work of the church to take the church to the next era. I think in the year 2020 and onwards, St. George's is going to face some exciting times of missionary work in evangelization of the word as well as social work.
That is just wonderful to hear, Bishop. And I know earlier, and Miriam put up a slide about this, where church is not really just a physical building or space. However, what a beautiful and majestic church building you have. And I'd like to take us back to Roy, who can share with us all the national and international accolades this beautiful, magnificent building has received in recent years.
Yeah, for the recognitions of the church, on the 4th of April 1996, St. George's was gazetted as a museum and historical site under the Antiquities Act. What does that mean? It brings that basically, you know, the church is completely considered as a heritage site, as a heritage church. Now, on the 31st of August 2007, we were actually awarded National Heritage status. Having that, we were the first church in Malaysia to be accorded National Heritage during that time in 2007. Then on the 25th of July 2009, when Penang celebrated the inscription of Georgetown and Malacca as UNESCO World Heritage Site, the announcement was actually made by CM in the church itself when he visited the church. So by that accolade, you know, we were quite honored. The church was quite honored to be in that sense, to be part of the celebration of Georgetown and Malacca as a UNESCO World Heritage in Penang itself.
Yes, it seems to me that finally the physical recognition and the spiritual reawakening is coming together at one point, and that's very exciting. Before I go on, can I, for all our participants here this evening, I don't see any cues in the chat box. At the start of the webinar, I had mentioned if you had any questions, please type in a cue. I'm going to give you a little bit more time to think of some questions you may have for Bishop or Roy or Miriam or myself this evening. Please feel free. We still have a little bit of time. I think we have 7 minutes left. So I'd like to take us back to Bishop, actually, because a point of interest I noted is that there is a pipe organ, in fact, now, a beautiful pipe organ in the church again. And as Roy had mentioned earlier, the very sad story about how the pipe organ in World War II was hacked into pieces and used for firewood and carted away. And this is only one of 5 pipe organs in the country, I understand, Bishop. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Now, when Bishop Middleton came to Penang in 1819, in his sermon, he said that the only thing that's missing in a good Anglican church is a pipe organ. And therefore, you see later, a pipe organ has been installed in St. George's, similar to what you see in the picture here, but later was destroyed in the World War I. And subsequently, we had another one, way back in the before Second World War, we had another pipe organ. Then we had another one, electronic one. And now what we have now is very unique. This pipe organ that you see this is uniquely built to suit the Malaysian context. If you look at it, it has a embroidery right up there, and it reflects Malaysian culture. It's built, it has 1,050 pipes installed inside, and it was donated by one of our church members, the family of Rebecca Tan, who we know is still, Rebecca is still around with us. And it is the family, the Tan family, that donated this at the cost of $1.3 million. Now, with this pipe organ, it is very majestic. It is brought back the splendor of worship. And when we wanted to install this, there were a lot of questions as to who will actually play this pipe organ. There are no pipe organists in town, and who would actually do that? And by the grace of God, we have raised 4 to 5 pipe organists within our own church members. And we see them growing. They have performed in organ recitals. They are learning. They've been tutored by an organ master by name of Leonard. And we have a few others. To name a few, we have Leonard, we have Jason, Audrey, we have Matthew, who else have we got now? Kaino, and we have a few more whom we are hoping to train. And we thank God for these young people. Our next task is to invest on all these young people, especially in St. George's, to invest on them and to train the generation that will build the church that is to come.
Can I just add on to that, Bishop? Because you've mentioned their names, but I find it so incredible because all of them are aged, or at least they started playing when they were 16 or 17. Yeah. And now some of them are just going into university. Some of them are, second year of university. So they're a young, dynamic group who have dedicated hours of practice and soul into bringing this sense of worship and liturgy into the church. And in fact, one of our pipe organists is a person named Peter Chin, and he used to be a student of St. Nicholas Home. He is visually impaired, and one of the, I think, very important things that I want to point out is he didn't exactly go for any formal training. He plays by ear, and as he was living in St. Nicholas, he would go to the piano and practice on his own. Earlier on in the webinar, we pointed out a man with the name of Mr. Breuer. He was the then headmaster, and he picked up Peter Chin's talent and sort of helped him embrace that gifting. And Peter would come to church and he played for many years. He reacquainted himself with this new organ, and he's been playing in church, even though he's visually impaired. So it's I think that's such a gift, isn't it? To own the gifts and skills that we have, and work hard towards bringing that back into the life of the church. I just wanted to point that out as well.
Thank you, Miriam, for highlighting. I must have missed out Peter Chin. He's a wonderful person. He's been playing the church organ for years.
Yes.
And also the organ at St. Nicholas Home. And in the early stages, he was so frightened to touch the pipe organ because he didn't know what to do and where to pull, which stops to pull and where to press the pedals. But he learned, even at a retired age, he learned and he's confident and he's playing for services now. I think we are very grateful to him because he is as far as I know, the only blind organist or pipe organist in the country.
Yeah, that is just an amazing story, and just starting from where our starting point of this building that was built by Indian convict labor that did not allow any locals to enter and worship, that only allowed English colonialists to worship, that was built with really the illicit money of the opium trade, today is a magnificent, beautiful building. And if I can quote Abraham Lincoln, of the people, for the people, by the people. But as I move on, I see that we have a question from Richard, from Professor Dr. Reverend Richard Lowe, who actually funded the major rebuilding of St. George's Church after World War II? Was it British or local?
So I've got some slides here that I'd like to show up. So can you all see this? I think you can. Sorry, let me just pull this up again. Okay, can you see this? Yes. In 1946, we have the Reverend Collier, who is appointed the first vicar of St. George's and the first archdeacon for North Malaya. Now, at this point, the church is still in ruins, and they come together and they have a service. And it's at this service where he has this very inspiring sermon, and he asks for the people to come together to raise funds towards the restoration of the church. And in this next slide, it states how much the government gave, and it's £60,000, I believe, with 10,000 from the parishioners. So here's where we go back to 1960, and I know I mentioned that the church was disestablished from the state. However, right up till Merdeka, so 1957, the church still, was given grants by the state, which would have helped in the years from the 1940s right up to the 1957. But here it does show that the government then contributed a lot towards the funding of the restoration of the church. And by 1948, the church was open again for services.
Thank you, Miriam, for covering that. So with that, I think I'm going to say goodnight to everyone and thank Bishop Charles, Roy Chai, and Miriam Samuel for all their hard work and sharing all these interesting details with folks. If you want to recommend watching this webinar, it is recorded. It will be available on YouTube as well as Facebook. Correct? And with that, I'm going to leave us with some slides. We had, leading up to the bicentenary last year, a number of high-profile visitors to the church. Notably, they are the then Archbishop of Southeast Asia, Boli Lapok. There was a visit from the Bishop of Calcutta, Ashok Biswas, which is important in re-establishing that connection from Bishop Middleton's years with India. And then there was the visit by His Royal Highness Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall. There was also a regular visitor to our church, our very own Chief Minister, YAB Chow Yao. And in fact, I think there was another historic incident last year, which was the first day covers that were produced. I think only the second time that a church was actually featured on a Malaysian stamp. So that happened last year. And then another visit from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I believe the first time the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, well, not really the head of the Church of England, but Bishop, can you correct me on that? The head of the church is the Queen.
He is the head of the Church of England, but John Sentamu, the Archbishop York,
yes,
he's a different person.
Okay.
Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the one who came. The man behind him is his chaplain.
John Sentamu.
Not John Sentamu.
Okay.
Oh,
Sorry
that's
about
John
that.
Sentamu. Okay. So Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was here last year. And And this was all leading up to the 200th year celebration. So congratulations, everyone. We're in the 3rd century of existence of St. George's Church, and a very, very good night to all of you.
Shamila, just hold on. We also had one visit by the Archbishop of Myanmar as well. The Most Reverend Stephen Tan Mien U, I think. Yes.
When was he here, Roy?
In 2016, February.
2016.
Yep.
Wonderful. So in the last few years, there's a lot more prominence attached, I think, to the church. It's become a place, a must-see and a must-visit for everyone, Anglican or not, with its fascinating history. Anything else anyone else wants to add?
That's all.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.